good to be here with you today. Thank you, Arlie, for the introductions, and thank you to the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy for having us here today. We are very pleased to be here with you. I gave a title to my talk of Building Peaceful and Harmonious Relationships through Tourism. And so I would like to carry a focus on that theme throughout my presentation here. First of all, a little bit about me and where I am from the Oglala Lakota tribal nation in the state of South Dakota in the United States. The Pine Ridge Indian Reservation is a large reservation of about 40,000 members, Lakota members in South Dakota. And that's where I was born and raised into that culture. Some of you who have read about or learned about Native Americans, Indigenous Americans, probably have a vision something like this in mind. And yes, this is perhaps the way some of our people looked in earlier times, but no more. This was one of our leaders by the name of Red Cloud. He was our warrior chief for many years, fighting the United States government to retain our territories, our lands, but eventually losing to the United States military. And shortly after our people surrendered to the United States military, within 2 years, the United States was sending our people to boarding schools. They wanted to assimilate us into United States society as English-speaking people, so they chose to conduct a war on our young people, on our youth, which I find just reprehensible. But included in this photograph is my great-grandmother, great-grandmother Lucy. And this is what she looked like in that photograph, and then what she looked like later on. She had 5 children, one of whom was my grandfather. She returned to the reservation, and after having been educated in the English ways, she returned and found that she could speak very little or no Lakota anymore, which was very distressing. However, she eventually learned the language again and lived a comfortable life. Here is another side of my family, my grandmother's side of the family, and they were the Standing Bear family. And seated in the near the middle is my great-great-grandfather, Chief Standing Bear. And he had 4 children at the very same boarding school, far from home. And the young man standing behind him was the eldest of his children. And on his right was a lady by the name of Victoria, another one of his children, and seating in the light-colored suits are 2 more of his children. So he believed in getting an education for his children, realizing that, yes, they must find a way to make it in the United States. These are images of other Native people in the region where I am from, the northern plains of the United States, the Great Plains. Other Indigenous people from around the world that some of whom we have come to know through these years of working in our organization called WINTA. Now here's the reason for being WINTA. We formed WINTA 9 years ago in Australia, and we wanted to use the vehicle of tourism, the tourism industry, to help our Indigenous communities throughout the world gain a better life for themselves. So we based it on Indigenous rights. The foundation of WINTA was Indigenous rights, looking after Indigenous rights throughout the world to help lead them into a better way of life. And this is the basis, the foundation, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which was adopted a number of years ago and accepted by just about all the nations in the world. But that doesn't mean they all implement this declaration. And that's what makes work for us and many other people, because there are so many violations of indigenous rights throughout the world. So what we did is we established a standard that would guide us in the tourism industry, also based upon that United Nations declaration, the Larrakia Declaration, which is named after a tribal nation around Darwin, Australia. Now, I won't get into these details, but these are the kinds of things that make for success for indigenous communities in the tourism industry. And there are some details here, technical details and otherwise, but what's most important is that the indigenous people must have an ownership of their enterprises, and that's at the top of the list here. I'll let you read them for just a moment, but I want to move on and discuss other matters here. And this is what relates us to our being here today. These standards for building relationships throughout the world. And they're all very important, and I will speak a little bit more detail on these. The first is sharing our knowledge, our indigenous knowledge of our wisdom that goes way back in time, perhaps thousands of years. Sharing that with our visitors and with the rest of the world. And then bringing about a cultural understanding with various other ethnic people and races throughout the world. Building closer relationships, and that's important. I want to talk about that more. Shared values such as compassion and generosity and hospitality. Those things are very important to our indigenous people, and we want to share them throughout the world. Interactions as equals. Indigenous people have not always been thought of as equals. We have been diminished in the eyes of many people throughout the world. We were known as savages and people who were perhaps not completely human. So we have had to overcome that, and we're still not completely there. We still don't have equal status in our homelands. And then hospitality, the great hospitality that we provide to our visitors, that bonds us to them and binds us to our visitors. I'll just give you a few images of some of the people that we know, indigenous people from around the world. This is a member of our leadership council, just as John and Frank here are on our leadership council for WINTA. Neville, Chief Ian Campbell from Canada. Here's Lennart. He's a Sami, indigenous Sami from northern Sweden. The Sami people, of course, are white people. They are the only indigenous people in all of Europe. And their homelands are in Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia. Here's a man that we know and love from the Maasai. He says, "Call me James." And this is part of our WINTA family, just a small part of our WINTA family that we traveled with through New Zealand and formed a bond among ourselves. And we still know each other well and work together well, the WINTA family. We have the importance of relationships applies to the natural world as well. As you probably realize, indigenous people have extremely strong connections to the natural world. And it's more than just a love of the land. It's something that is deeply ingrained in us from the beginning of time. And that's wherein lies our wisdom, is the knowledge of the natural world, whether it's the land, the waters, the air. And then we have the relationship with animals, also very important. They're part of this same natural world that I mentioned. Even the unfriendly animal worlds, which this little animal didn't like me taking a photograph of him, and he would have done harm to me if I would have stayed there very long. but nevertheless part of the natural world that we have a connection to. This photograph represents a reciprocal relationship that the natural world has within itself. These reciprocal relationships are not completely understood even by scientists today. But in our indigenous world, we attempted to understand what these reciprocal relationships are about. And this represents reciprocity in its very simplest form. The flower feeds the butterfly, it feeds the bee, and it feeds other insects. And these insects, in turn, distribute the pollen of the flower so that it can regenerate itself. So what we look for is reciprocal relationships in the world as well. Just as we have our partners here in our WINTA family, where we have developed reciprocal relationships. When you give, you take. When you take, you give. And that's underlines a lot of our societies, is this business of giving and taking with no expectation of return. Relationships among tribal nations in America is becoming more and more well known as we seek ways of becoming more peaceful and more harmonious. And I'll give you 3 little examples here. The Cherokee Nation has a concept that they call tohi, which is all about building relationships. From a relationship with yourself, you have to know yourself to begin with in order to be successful, and then relationships with your family, with your village, your community, with your tribal nations, and then relationships with the rest of the world. And these tribal nations, as do many others, believe only that through these relationships can you have peace and harmony and balance in the world and in the universe as well. The Navajo call it Hojoni, but it's the very same concept. And then my people, Lakota, we call it Wo-Lakota. And without these relationships, we would have no civilizations, we would have no society, and we would have no peace and no harmony. So this is what we tell the world as part of our indigenous wisdom. Here again is the same list of items that I showed you a little bit earlier, just as a reminder of the things that we stand for in indigenous societies and in indigenous tourism as well. I would end this with what amounts to be a prayer, which says, Tunkashila wakantaka, unchimaka, le iachbiayo. And what that is, it's a prayer that you give to the earth, to the universe in the morning, where you make an offering. The day is being offered to the Great Spirit, to Grandfather, and to Grandmother Earth. And with that, we also say after every prayer, we say mitakoyasin, which means we are all related in the world. Everything and everyone is our relatives in the natural world, and that includes human beings. It includes the water and the air, and the rocks and the soil, and the mountains and the plains and the waters. I said waters, but yes, we are all related. So all of you in this room are related to me, to us. You are our brothers and sisters. And I would just like to leave you with that comment. This is my grandson, by the way. Thank you very much for this.